Hello out there across the planet. This is JLL, the Gnostic voice on the internet, talking to you once again and inviting you to Mythophrenia in action. That's the generic name or comprehensive title I'm using for the talks that I'll be uploading on the internet following the completion of the Gnostic investigation of the Mandela effect just last month. So you'll hear me repeat that term, Mythophrenia in action, at the beginning of these talks from now on. I'm recording on the 28th of November 2017, and I'm calling this talk Archontic Dementia. The AI robot Sophia is a fraud. So what I will attempt to do, what I wish to do in this talk, is first of all give you an orientation to what I mean by archontic dementia. And I'm going to introduce a new acronym, ADF, regarding everything that is archontic by the Gnostic definition. I'm going to stick rigorously to the Gnostic perspective on the archons and all things archontic. And once I've presented that orientation, then I will give you my fix, my hit, my opinion, if you will, on the highly controversial and enormously hyped subject of the AI robot, Sophia, who was introduced just last month, introduced to the entire world in connection with events in Saudi Arabia. So with that introduction, I shall begin. Now, from the point of view of my career as a Gnostic teacher on the internet, the proper place to begin would be in June or July, I think it was July, of the year 2002, just over 15 years ago. And in that month, around the 4th of July, I think American Independence Day, metahistory.org went online. And since that time, coming forward for 15 years, that site has been the principal source of Gnostic intel and Gnostic teaching regarding the truth about the ancient mysteries and the mystery schools, and dedicated to the recovery of the fallen goddess scenario, FGS, that is to say, the astronomical myth of the goddess Sophia. And at that time, my work was supported by a certain foundation in the United States called the Marian Foundation, M-A-R-I-O-N, having nothing to do with Marian apparitions of the Virgin Mary. It's simply named after a place in Massachusetts. Now, I recall clearly that I was at the headquarters of the Marian Foundation, or Marian Institute, as it's now called, in November of 2001, right after the 9/11 event. I was there to present a talk on Gnosticism, and I shared the stage with noted Gnostic scholar from Princeton University, Elaine Pagels. Sometime during the events of the conference, I was sitting in a little alcove where people take tea and have a little lunch with one of the sponsors at the Marian Foundation, who got me started with the website, which I created for them and for their purposes at that time. That is to say, I created metahistory.org as an instrument and organ of that foundation at that time. And I remember that individual asking me, "Well, John, are you going to tell the world about the archons?" Now, this was 5 years before Not in His Image came out And yet I had enough Gnostic material on hand, I had enough research behind me to be able to present the theme of the Archons to the world at large, and I did so. In the summer of 2002, when the site went online. Now I want to emphasize to you that the intel I've presented on the Archons is unique and unparalleled on the internet. Even though the term Archon, and occasionally the adjective Archontic, but less so, has become extremely familiar and widely used on the internet, even though it has, as they say, quote, gone viral, end quote, over these 15 years, I remain the individual, or I should say, I remain the individual who introduced the term, and I stand rigorously by the initial conditions that I applied when I did so. Now, I'm going to remind you of what these initial conditions are. The word Archon comes out of the Greek Hellenic period of Alexander the Great and Cleopatra and the Christian Gospels, if you will. And it simply meant governor or ruler of the time. So there was the Archon of a certain region of the Roman Empire, was the governor. But in the Gnostic scenario, coming out of the mystery schools, the Teleste, or the illumined shamans of that movement, had a concept of the Archons which came from their deep perception of the origin of the solar system and of humanity itself. And according to that scenario, which is extensively presented on metahistory.org as well as in my book, the Archons are an extraterrestrial cyborg species. They actually are a species of their own, a certain kind of entity which has a certain physical presence and physical form, and they inhabit the solar system at large. This is according to the perspective of the Gnostic intel. They do not inhabit the earth, and they cannot inhabit the earth. They cannot, due to the fact that the conditions of the biosphere and the high presence of oxygen and other factors are inimical to their own makeup, which is basically a silica and mercury organism, an insect-like or locust-like organism. Now, the Archons can shapeshift, and they can take various forms in their own world. What makes the Archons really dangerous for humanity is that they can remote view the human race, which they've been doing for countless aeons of time, and they can project their presence into the human mind and even into the atmosphere of the earth by the use of a faculty they possess called Hal, H-A-L. Hal is a Coptic word meaning simulation, mimesis, or virtual reality. So the Archons can and do appear in various forms in the human world, and they even intrude upon the biosphere through this faculty of Archontic simulation, or HAL. And so there have been many encounters with these entities throughout time. And the Nag Hammadi materials from Egypt, discovered in 1945 in Egypt, give some explicit and vivid accounts of direct encounters with the Archons, and they also describe how to deal with these malevolent and intrusive entities. So, the Archons are an extraterrestrial species that arose prior to the formation of the Earth and prior to the appearance of the human species on Earth. That's why they're called Archons, because the name comes from a Greek root, archai, meaning first or from the beginning or before everything else. The archons are an anomaly in the solar system. They are due to an anomaly introduced by the Aeon Sophia herself. So you can say, yes, if you want to put it in that language, it's the fault of the planetary mother, Sophia, that the archons are entangled in the divine experiment on Earth. And facing the archons as such as they are, a predatory extraterrestrial species, is one of the great challenges of this experiment. Now, Archontic is an adjective that can be applied to everything that derives from the archons. Archon and Archontic. You now have the Gnostic background. You have the rigorous Gnostic intel. When I speak about the archons, I stay faithful to this intel, and I follow the narrative. I follow the Sophianic vision story, because that story is the necessary narrative frame for you to work in your imagination with this intel. If you do not work within that frame with this intel, you will not be able to handle the intel correctly. So many people talking about the archons today do not handle the material correctly, and they speculate and they extrapolate upon the concept of archon, which the Gnostic teacher introduced into conventional discourse 15 years ago. So you can listen to them if you like, but I warn you that when you listen to other people talk about the archons, if they are not doing so in the framework of the Gnostic narrative of Sophia, then they are bound to speak incorrectly and bound to fabulate, to indulge in make-believe, in fantasy, and to present you with misleading information. Clear enough? Now, the subject of the archons, which scholars like Elaine Pagels tend to downplay or avoid entirely. For instance, in her book, The Gnostic Gospels, which broke the Nag Hammadi material out into the world at large, introduced it to the mainstream. In that book, The Gnostic Gospels, which is wrongly titled, you will find in the index no reference to the archons. Nevertheless, the material concerning the archons constitutes at least 1/5, and probably a little bit more, of the total amount of material in the Nag Hammadi writings and related writings about the Gnostics, as for instance found in the polemics of the Church Fathers. So the archons are a big deal, and the subject is one of continual and ongoing interest and excitement and challenge among those of you out there who, like myself, live in the Sophianic narrative. That is the myth by which we live. It is the myth to guide the species. Now, I'm not going to elaborate on all the ways in which the archons operate, but let me give you a quick summary and bring the description down to the subject of IT and AI, robotics, the fembot Sophia, and all that jazz. Primarily, the archons operate upon the human mind. Well, for one thing, they do a lot of remote viewing. Whole teams of them stare at the back of your head. And they remote view, and they try to capture the human animal in various ways. I've explained this in talks I gave, I think, in the year 2000. By remote viewing, they try to capture the limbic system of the human animal. They transmit shortwave frequencies similar to those that come out of the towers that carry telecommunication signals for iPhones and other technology. The archons are not alive. They do not breathe, for instance. An archontic entity does not breathe. It operates on an electrical field grounded in a mercury base and sealed in a number of silicon formats, which are equivalent to the Intel chips of a computer. I'm talking now principally about the embryonic form of the archons, described in the Gnostic texts as resembling the aborted fetus, the aborted fetus, huhe in Coptic. The aborted fetus really means the premature fetus. Why did the Gnostics choose this bizarre image of a prematurely born fetus to describe the Whitley Schreiber form of the archons? Well, because it resembles that bug-eyed entity with spindly limbs. A prematurely born fetus, huhe in Coptic, would have a large head, correct, and a spindly body, correct? And don't forget to add this. This is the most important point in that brilliant description coming from the Gnostic masters of the mysteries. The aborted fetus is born dead. So by using that analogy, using that metaphoric description of the archons, which is an accurate description of one of their prominent forms, the Gnostic masters were bringing your attention to the very great fact that the archons are not alive in the way that we are alive. They are not AI or AL, which is artificial life. There is no such thing as artificial life. They are an artificial form, organism, that appears to be lifelike, as a robot appears to be lifelike. But they are not invested with life in the same manner as the human animal and other animals living in the biosphere of the planet. So where was I? Yeah, the archons have this particular form, that is the form of the hive entity, and then they have a draconic, or reptilian form, which is the form taken by the overlords of the archontic hive or horde, of which there are billions and billions. One of the principal ways they operate upon the human animal, apart from staring at the back of your head, they also use flicker, feeding flicker into your eyes and inducing a trance state. So as I said once, they get you coming and going. If they can't get you from behind the head, which produces depression and confusion in the human animal when they manage to penetrate into the limbic system, then they'll put you in an archontic trance through the use of flicker. And that, of course, is demonstrated. That technique, of course, is demonstrated by that wonderful invention known as the television. In the television, the archons are actually televiewing you. But bear in mind that they did not invent the television. Human beings invented the television. It just happens to be a device that is extremely compatible to the archons and assists them in their attempted takeover of our species. Now, I'll return to this point several times in this talk. The difference between IT, informational technology, and AI, artificial intelligence, which are products of human invention, and the ET mind itself, which is extra-human, non-human. They're not the same, but at a certain point, they interface. One of the main ways that the archons have intruded upon our species is through channeling. And they have introduced into the mind of the human species certain concepts of religious ideology which are very destructive to our way of life. Primarily the ideology of the master race and of racial supremacy, the ideology of salvation, the ideology of an apocalyptic annihilation of the human species. All these religious ideologies prominent in the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, come from the archons. They have been suggested into the human mind by the archons. And in fact, back in the days of certain theocrats and rulers in the Middle East, stemming from the time of Sargon of Akkad, who was the first one, I believe, who was named and historically verified, and coming down through that period of the Middle Eastern theocracies, you will find the presence of the archons. It is a very known fact, very well known and well established fact among scholars, that those theocratic kingdoms of the Middle East, in those kingdoms, the ruler, governor, or authority always had advisors and handlers who were psychics and channelers. They were called roughly the Chaldeans. They were always the Chaldean. Chaldean is kind of a code name for psychic channelers. Just as President Ronald Reagan had an astrologer who advised him in the matter of his meetings with Gorbachev, and may have had psychics in the background. Well, these ancient Middle Eastern rulers always had psychics, and some of these psychics channeled the archons. And through that channeling, the archons introduced their alien mindset into the human mind. And it was taken on as if it were something of the human mind, which it is not. But part of the deception of the archons is that they persuade you that their way of thinking is actually yours. You see, they cannot become what we are, and they cannot physically overtake the human species. But they can persuade us and trick us into becoming more and more like they are. And they do that through, principally, in one way, through religious ideology. So the Anunnaki script, which is the slave species meme, which is widely discussed on the internet, often in connection with the archons, is actually a result of a channeling from the archons into the human mind. If you go to metahistory.org and go to the archon files, you will see that I have described at length the various theories of archontic intrusion. And I have given the core Gnostic material that explains this type of intrusion through the implantation of a religious ideology which is actually alien and destructive to our species. And that religious ideology today is recognized as the Semitic tradition of Judaism, which informs both Christianity on the one hand and Islam on the other. This Semitic religion of Judaism is an archontic implant in the human mind, a foreign installation, as Carlos Castaneda would have called it. You know, I was listening recently to someone on the internet who was talking about the weaponized use of so-called migrants and refugees coming into Europe, and the use of these people who are largely Muslims and people of color from Africa and the Middle East, alien races to the European land, the use of these people to displace the European population and in fact perpetrate an act of genocide upon the Europeans. And in the process of discussing this problem, the individual mentioned that it was totally alien for a child in Sweden or a child in Germany or Spain or England to be taught stories of the Bible, stories from the Old Testament, such as Abraham and the burning bush, as if these stories were part of the lineage of those children. Because, and I can very much relate to that, because when I was a child growing up in Friendship, Maine, and I attended Sunday school, well, there you have it. I can even remember the name of the Sunday school teacher. Her name was Verena Simmons. And she used to present illustrations at a child's level, the level of a fairy tale, of certain episodes that happened in the Old Testament. The parting of the Red Sea, Abraham and the burning bush, the writing of the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, as if these stories had anything whatsoever to do with me. And so the commentator was pointing out that it's ridiculous and dangerous for people in the West and in Europe to take on these stories that come from a Semitic Judaic background in the Middle East. Such stories, such tales, have nothing to do with the origins and way of life of European people or people anywhere else in the world, in South America, in Polynesia, in China. But the point that he made was still not complete enough in my mind. He stated that the Semitic fairy tales of Abraham, Moses, and so forth were foreign to European countries and European peoples. Well, that's obvious, isn't it? Well, I say to you, I up the ante. I say to you, speaking from the Gnostic perspective, that those Semitic fairy tales of religion, which carry the Archontic ideology, are not only alien to Europe, they're alien to the entire planet. They don't even belong on the planet. Semitic religious ideology of the master race doesn't even belong on this planet. It doesn't belong in this experiment. It is an alien transplant. Now, those of you who followed my Gnostic investigation of the Mandela effect will remember my analysis of the first supercluster, the Volkswagen Ford logo supercluster. And you will recall that I decoded in that cluster a clear reference to this problem, the problem of master race ideology and its attendant program of genocide. So you can see that some of the themes and topics I'm developing here in the first talk in Mythophrenia in Action echo and repeat the material of that investigation. So moving ahead, because I'm still in the orientation to this talk, how else do the Archons intrude upon the human animal? Well, through HAL, which you can translate as virtual reality. You know, when people encounter these ETs, when they have an ET abduction experience, that is due to the projection of virtual reality into the human mind. They do actually experience them, but in the manner of someone who would say, wear one of those helmets that are now available, supposedly. You can put on a helmet and you can stand in a booth with skis on and ski gear, and you can appear to yourself through the virtual reality technology that is operating through this casket, this helmet that you're wearing. You can appear to be skiing on Mont Blanc. That's virtual reality. Well, the Archons use that to perform these abductions to the extent that ET abductions are genuine, and some of them are. Some of them are not at all done by the ETs. So, they use virtual reality, they use a massive assault of short wave radiation pulses to attack the human creature. This is a fact. It's also a very great fact, and I'm happy to announce this to you, that since September of 2014, the human species has been shielded from these microwave assaults by the Archons coming from outside the solar system. There is still a problem with the microwave technology on Earth, a great problem with that microwave technology. But as regards the massive waves and blasts, the continual blast of shortwave radiation proceeding from the Archons in the external solar system toward the Earth, that's over. That's finished. The Ionic Mother herself established a shield in September and October of 2014, and you can go and read about that shield. Scientists actually detected it, and they were extremely baffled as to how it could have suddenly appeared as if overnight. And due to that shield being erected around the Earth, humanity at large is now protected from the ongoing onslaught of the Archons. But there is still a problem of dealing with the Archontic factor in our midst. The Archontic factor that human beings have incorporated and internalized in themselves is still a great problem. And that leads to the subject of Archontic dementia. Finally, passing on to the third aspect, I'm outlining 4 aspects here of Archontic intrusion. The third aspect actually involves a virus or viral infection. I've pointed out many times in my talks and writings, and I repeat this again as a matter of imperative importance to those of you who want to get this story straight. The Archons never achieved a genetic hack into the human genome, but they did achieve a neural hack into the human brain. And there are some human animals walking around on this planet who carry the Archontic neural infection in their brains. That Archontic neural infection inhabits the neural circuits in a manner that conceals itself behind the chemical L-DOPA. So where L-DOPA is detected in the brain of these infected individuals, and not all human animals are infected in this way. In fact, a very, very small fraction of them are. Where this neural infection, which is kind of like a mucoid sheathing over the neural circuits, occupies the human brain, it is veiled behind the chemical L-DOPA. Therefore, it is very difficult to detect. During the MED talks, I mentioned this Archontic infection, and I said that I would explain how it occurred, which I'll get around to probably in this new series of talks. Finally, we come to that aspect of the Archontic intrusion upon the human species, which relates really closely to AI. Obviously, HAL, as virtual reality, relates closely to AI. But I invite you to consider a term that is even more pertinent here, and that is the term mimetic. M-I-M-E-T-I-C. Now you will note that the term mimetic is nothing new, no big deal. You've heard it a million times, haven't you? But you will find, if you pay attention, that the presumed masterminds of AI and IT, such as the people at Hanson Robotics who created the fembot Sophia, will use this term, mimetics. Elon Musk will use this term, mimetics. He has a particular spin on it, and I'll get around to Elon Musk. You can be sure of that. So mimetics means the science or technique of simulation, of mimicking something. Actually, the word corresponding to mimetics and the Gnostic intel that warns us about the mimetics of the archons can be found in the Nag Hammadi writings. Antimimon, Antimimon. Antimimon is actually a Greek term in the Nag Hammadi writings, and it is characteristic of the archons. They are said to perform anti-mimon, which I have translated as counter-mimicry. Now, what is counter-mimicry? Well, it means very simply that you mimic or imitate something, but that which is the imitation reverses the purpose or meaning of that which is imitated. So, AI, artificial intelligence, is counter-mimicry, anti-mimon of the archons. How is that so? Because artificial intelligence mimics or replicates living intelligence, but then it turns around and counteracts living intelligence by representing living intelligence as if it were not alive. AI is not alive, yet it mimics the intelligence that is alive. That is counter-mimicry. Look at the robots that are being created these days. Look at the fembot, Sophia. She is the vivid representation of counter-mimicry. All of her circuits, all of her programs have been created by mimesis, applied in a technological manner. I'm not making that claim. The people who created and handle her are making that claim. So she mimics or imitates a living human being. It, the fembot. But the fembot, it, is not alive. That is counter-mimicry. Counter-mimicry is one of the fourth signature in my little inventory here of the archons. So with that note, at the 37-minute mark, I think I can say that my orientation is complete, and I can go directly to the topic of this invention coming from the company Hanson Robotics, the AI robot Sophia. My purpose in this talk, in the remaining half an hour, is not to convince you of anything. I'm not just going to shove my opinion in your face and expect you to believe it. But I warn you that what I'm telling you is more than just an opinion. My intention is to give you the basis to realize with confidence, with the confidence of your own mind, that the AI robot Sophia is a complete fraud. And it's my intention that you would see through this fraud and not be duped. So I have a strong personal motive here for my friends and allies out there across the planet, those who still care and dare to listen. And that personal motive is, I want you to sober up and wise up and recognize the fraud that is presented to you when it is right before your eyes. Now let me give you a short personal anecdote. I think I was about 10 or 11 years old when we got our first television in Friendship, Maine. It was a really big deal. There were 3 channels, 3 networks. And it was a black and white TV. I can picture it very well. So there I am, 10, 11-year-old child in the mid-1950s, watching television. What were the programs? What were the first programs that I saw? Well, one of them was I Love Lucy. And of course, how wonderful it is that the I Love Lucy theme shows up in the encoded material in the Mandela effect. Linking, of course, and interlocking with Peanuts and Lucy Van Pelt and Linus Van Pelt in the cartoon series. Now, additionally, there was another program that came on a little bit later, The Twilight Zone, and how many of the themes and stories and plots of The Twilight Zone, coming from Rod Serling, have been realized since that time. So there was I Love Lucy, Twilight Zone, and one of the other earliest memories I have of watching television was seeing a comedian named Edgar Bergen. And he was a man from a Swedish ancestry, actually, therefore a Euro-American, a Swedish child of Swedish immigrants in the United States. And he was known for his act with a dummy named Charlie McCarthy. So technically what Edgar Bergen did was to perform ventriloquism, which means speaking from the chest or speaking from the throat without moving the mouth. So he held on his lap the dummy, Charlie McCarthy, and he conversed with the dummy. So Edgar Bergen, the man, spoke, and then Charlie McCarthy responded, and Edgar Bergen controlled the head movements and the mouth movements of the dummy with his right hand, and he projected his voice into the dummy, so it appeared as if Charlie McCarthy was speaking. When you looked at Edgar Bergen, you couldn't see his lips move because that is the gift of ventriloquism, to speak without moving your lips and without revealing that you are speaking. But obviously, anyone who, observed this, anyone who sits down and watches this act, is going to know that the ventriloquist, Edgar Bergen, is speaking the words of the dummy, Charlie McCarthy. Now, I have never seen a live act of ventriloquism, but I was certainly impressed and amused by this early instance that I saw on television. Now, just imagine any one of you sitting in an auditorium, in a theater, watching on stage the act of a ventriloquist. This could be an extremely accomplished ventriloquist. So the human, real live ventriloquist is sitting there, and on his or her lap, or beside him, perhaps standing independently, is the dummy, and a conversation ensues, right? The ventriloquist says one thing, the dummy responds. Sometimes what the dummy says is really funny. Wow, the dummy's cracking jokes. The dummy has a great sense of humor. It winks and it moves its head in an animated and amusing way, and all that, and so on and so forth. But just hold on a minute here. What kind of creature are you? I'm asking you. Would you, sitting in the auditorium watching this spectacle, actually believe that the dummy was speaking out of its own volition and that it was producing spontaneously everything that it was saying? Would you actually believe that? Of course not. You would allow yourself to play along with the amusing illusion that the dummy is speaking. But if you were to be convinced that the dummy actually was autonomous and could compose its own sentences, could comment and joke and wink and move its face in certain expressions. If you were to convince yourself that that was the case, well, you would be slightly demented. Of course, it's an easy example, isn't it? Who among you who are hearing my words right now would be fooled or would fool yourself into thinking that a ventriloquist dummy is actually speaking autonomously? Nevertheless, that is what you are being invited to do with the AI fembot, Sophia. Now, I want to be sure that I'm getting across to you here. Am I making myself clear? I'm making a claim here. Quite a large claim. The claim is that whoever is presenting the AI fembot named Sophia to the world, the people at Hanson Robotics and whoever is working with them or whoever is behind them, whoever the creators and handlers of Sophia may be, they are, I claim, duping you. They are committing a massive act of fraud before the eyes of the world. They are passing off this simulacrum, this robotic simulacrum, designed to mimic a human being in appearance and designed to mimic the expressions, language, and thought processes of a living human being, as if it were alive in its own right, as if it were a living, intelligent, autonomous entity. But it is not. It is not. Now let's just stop for a moment, because I want you to look very carefully at what I'm saying, and I want you to get your minds around where I'm coming from. Why am I saying this, and on what do I base this view of this phenomenon that has been paraded now before the eyes of the world over the last couple of months? Significantly, as some of you will certainly know, if you followed the Gnostic investigation of the Mandela effect, it is a remarkable synchronistic or synchro-mystical event to see this fembot paraded before the world at this very particular and exact moment, considering everything that I said in the Mandela effect investigation about the Aeon Sophia. Everything that I said about her autonomy. The Aeonic Mother has agency. About her ability to scan the human psyche, to have an impact upon human memory circuits, to penetrate into the subconscious and also to penetrate through the CERN membrane into the first attention of the human animal. Her ability to hack the internet and to manipulate content on the internet. Everything that I have said about the living planetary divinity of Sophia is grotesquely and fraudulently mirrored in the Sophia robot. So it's not any accident that they have brought out this entity, that they have brought this dummy upon the stage of the world at this time. Now, I'd like to say that the conclusion that you can draw from this message, from this talk, is Clear, simple, and straightforward. I'll tell you what the takeaway is, in case you were wondering. The AI fembot, Sophia, is a fraud perpetrated upon the world to convince the world that the state of AI, of artificial intelligence, the technology of AI, is far, far more advanced than it actually is. And far more advanced, actually, than it ever can be. It can never be as far advanced as those who put Sophia before the eyes of the world would like the world to believe. So there is an intention, there is an agenda that comes with Sophia. Oh, you bet there is. And there are several aspects to that agenda. And it's no accident that it was introduced in Saudi Arabia simultaneous with the announcement of the government of Saudi Arabia to produce and create this futuristic city that runs on robotics and IT technology, NEOM. It's no accident that she is presented to the world as it were the poster robot and spokes robot, speaking robot, who stands for this project, the city of NEOM, and who has identified with it, and who has been given the status of citizenship by the government of Saudi Arabia. This is all part of the scheme. It's all part of the agenda of the people behind Sophia. And it's all part of the fraud. Those who invented her and who are handling her, and I'll get to the handling in a moment, get to the particulars of the handling, want the world at large to believe that they have achieved a singularity in AI. Now, this term singularity gets thrown around quite a bit. One usage of it can be found in the writings of Ray Kurzweil, who is a transhumanist and a big fan of AI and the merging of human intelligence with artificial intelligence, or even the dissolution of the human mind into the cyber Archontic mind. But I'm not thinking of that individual right now. I'm thinking more of the notion of singularity as it has been associated in recent talk, October, November 2017. Recent talk, recent chatter, conversations, and interviews centered on the Sophia robot. In this particular context, singularity means this. It means the event and the moment of the event when AI overtakes the human intelligence that created it. That is how singularity is being defined in relation to the Sophia robot. That simulacrum, that android, is said to represent the proof and demonstration that AI technology has created a human-like instrument that can actually perform in such a way that its intelligence exceeds the intelligence of the human species. And so the singularity of November 2017 is that. It is said to be that. And I say to you that such a claim is entirely fraudulent. AI can never exceed the human intelligence that created it. It can never excel in the purely human linguistic and intellectual features of our species. It can excel in certain tasks. We know this already. A computer can compile a list and sort through a list and make an inventory more rapidly and in some respects more neatly and accurately and concisely than a human being. True, but all the elements of the inventory, if it's a book catalog of 50,000 books, all of those books have to be entered by human hands into the database of the computer, and then the program that is designed to organize that material, the titles, the subjects, the authors, and so forth, of those 50,000 books, the software that's going to handle and manage and organize it also has to be created by human beings. It has to come from the human mind. Once that whole package is put together, then you can sit down at a keyboard and the IT tool, your computer, will be able to make comparisons and book searches and calculations more rapidly and effectively than a human being could do. But it can only do that because it's already been set up to do that by human beings. What is being claimed about the fembot Sophia is more than that. The claim is that she is autonomous, that she stands there on the stage and converses in a Q&A and makes jokes and makes snide comments about, well, she won't destroy humanity. If you're nice to me, I'll be nice to you. And you are expected to believe that it is actually an android entity speaking out of its own artificial mind that would express itself in that way. You're expected to believe that. Do you believe that? Now, what I believe, my humble opinion about the actual capacities of this fembot, this android, could be easily dismissed in this way. Well, hey, John Lash, who in the hell do you think you are? Do you think that you know enough about the advanced science and technology and code work and theoretical background and technical electronic background and cybernetic science? Do you know enough about all that and about the writing of computer codes to say that AI has not reached a singularity in which it surpasses human intelligence? And you can dismiss me and say, I'm claiming they can't do that simply because in my petty little mind, I can't conceive of how they would do that. Well, I'm telling you, I can't conceive of how they would do that because I know it's impossible to do that. It is impossible for an archontic entity created by human beings to surpass the human intelligence that created it. But that's the claim that is attached to Sophia. Sophia is nothing more than a ventriloquist dummy. Now, a ventriloquist dummy has to have a ventriloquist. Does she have a ventriloquist like Charlie McCarthy, the dummy, had the ventriloquist Edgar Bergen? Okay? Well, yeah, it's a handler. She has a handler. So when she's on stage speaking, the words that she speaks are not being spoken by the android that you see. They're being spoken by someone behind a screen, someone you can't see, speaking with a human voice, transmitting the sentences that he or she pronounces through a wireless device into a receiver that is so arranged that the language spoken by the human handler appears to come out of the mouth of the AI Sophia robot. The other aspect of the setup of this robot is the expressions on the face. There is some expression on the face, a kind of smile, kind of movements of the head, kind of movements of the eyes that go along with the vocal and verbal expressions coming from the fembot. Well, what about those expressions of the android, of the archontic simulacrum? What about them? Well, There is a kind of technology, and I don't know what it's called. I don't know the technical term for it, but it's a mimetic technology that's well known and has existed for many years. You might have heard about this technology, and it works like this. You have a human subject. You have, say, a man sitting in a booth, and the booth is equipped with sensors that biometrically scan and map his face. And then over here on the side, you have a computer screen, and there is software that creates on the computer screen an avataric or cybernetic double of the man in the booth. The man in the booth might also be rigged with electrodes that are attached to particular parts of his face and jaw, or the corner of his eyes, areas where muscles move with facial expression. So there are two kinds of sensors operating in this setup. The sensors that scan his face biometrically, recording every detail and reproducing it in the Archontic avatar on the computer screen. And then, through the additional technology, the software that now exists makes it possible for the expressions on the face of the avatar on the computer screen to mimic those of the living human subject. So if the man in the booth winks his left eye, then the avataric image corresponding to him, his avataric or archontic double, if you will, winks his left eye. If the man smiles, the archontic double smiles. So that kind of technology is well known. As a matter of fact, I remember back in the fall of 2016, someone made a claim on the internet that an interview supposed to be taking place with Julian Assange wasn't really an interview with Assange. It was an interview with a sort of three-dimensional CGI replica of Assange. And it has been said, the rumors going around the internet, you know how these things are, folks. It has been said that some of the supposed living human people that you see on television and on various internet presentations are not really living human people at all, but they are three-dimensional, holographic, avataric creations that mimic the speech and expressions of living human creatures. So this technology is no surprise. It exists. It's been proven that it exists. Now apply this technology to the fembot Sophia. There is a handler. There is someone sitting in a booth who feeds her the answers to questions given to her, which are also pre-scripted. Someone who feeds her her supposedly original lines and statements that she makes. Someone who feeds her the jokes, who actually says the jokes, which are then broadcast through a microphone, wirelessly controlled microphone, so that it appears as if the android was telling the joke. And additionally, the handler is wired up in correspondence with the facial expressions of the robot. So when the handler smiles or nods, the robot immediately smiles and nods. The AI fembot Sophia is nothing but a dummy, no better than Charlie McCarthy, no better than a Muppet. In fact, I prefer the Muppets. That's all she is. It's an enormous fraud. All right? Suppose it isn't an enormous fraud. Suppose that I am mistaken. Suppose that I just don't believe that AI could be so advanced. And it's just my ignorance and my refusal to give AI its credit that accounts for me taking this position. Suppose, suppose, suppose. Well, I can see the reasonableness of that objection. Now listen to where I go with that. I have two things to say. First thing is, I know that if I was put on the stage, or anybody else was put on the stage with Sophia, posing to that entity, that android, certain questions, that it would be immediately obvious that it cannot answer those questions and that it cannot respond in an intelligent way. Immediately obvious. You can bet that Sophia's making the rounds, isn't she? You see her talking to various people, don't you? You can bet that those interviews, just like all the other bullshit in the mainstream media, are totally controlled and prescripted. Everything that is going to be said to her, every question going to be put to her, is prescripted, and all of her answers, all of her dialogue is prescripted and read from the script by her handler. Period. And if that is not true, then they can prove it by putting her up on the stage with someone who has questions of which her handlers have no foreknowledge. And it goes further than that. It gets better. Have you ever heard of the Turing test? Turing. It's named after a British mathematician and codebreaker and one of the theoreticians and pioneers of IT named Alan Turing. And the Turing test is a test to which an android such as Sophia is subjected or can be subjected for the purpose of seeing what its true capacities are. In fact, the Turing test proposed by Alan Turing is a straightforward way to determine if an android robot such as Sophia has capacities which are sufficiently human-like that it could pass for human. In other words, the Turing test is designed to show if the human simulacrum, the substitute, the archontic duplicate of the human, could actually pass for human, if it could pass that test. Now, everybody in the realm of IT knows what the Turing test is. It's kindergarten material. All of these great masterminds, the people behind Hanson Robotics, Elon Musk, I'll get to you, all these other people who are involved in this big fraud, in this big event of Archontic Dementia, AD. All of them know what the Turing test is. So why don't they offer to demonstrate what they claim Sophia to be by putting her through the Turing test before the eyes of the entire world? In fact, I challenge them to do that. I call upon them to do that. I dare them to conduct a Turing test with the fembot Sophia before the eyes of the world, on a stage, filmed and recorded by objective parties. Now that Turing test would operate like this, because this is how a Turing test is set up. There is the android or archontic entity said to be able to imitate human behavior and thought and speech to the point where it is indistinguishable from a living human creature. And then there is a human creature. So the test would involve putting Sophia on the stage with a human woman and putting them both behind screens. Then in front of those two screens sits the moderator. And this is the individual who puts questions to both of the entities behind the screens. You see how it works? And the moderator discourses and dialogues, has a back and forth with figure A behind one screen, figure B behind the other screen. One of those figures, A or B, is an android. The other is a real living being. The moderator asks questions, prompts the two subjects to speak on certain matters, and the object of the Turing test is for the moderator to observe the responses and to determine if the archontic entity can be detected and distinguished from the human entity. Let's call them subjects. The archontic subject, the human subject of the experiment. If the archontic subject cannot be distinguished from the human subject, then the android passes the Turing test. If not, the android fails. I challenge every mastermind on this planet who is involved in this enormous fraud to conduct the Turing test with the android fembot, Sophia. And I insist on certain conditions of this test, one of which I will state now. The test must be conducted with Sophia in a Faraday cage. The android must be seated in a Faraday cage, which is a device that completely shields out any electronic or electromagnetic frequencies. So if Sophia is positioned in a Faraday cage, that ensures that it cannot be influenced externally and cannot receive wirelessly dialogue that would be fed to it by a human handler. And there are other conditions as well, but that's an absolutely essential condition. Now, I'm a person of no power and influence in the world, certainly not in the world of IT, AI, and all that jazz. So I'm in no position to demand anything of anyone. But those of you out there who hear my words and find some reason in what I'm saying might have the opportunity to contact someone in this world, who knows, someone in the genre of IT technology that has produced this AI fembot, and you can ask them, well, hold on, wait a minute. Isn't the Turing test like a fundamental concept, a fundamental tool of AI? Well, has Sophia undergone the Turing test? And if not, well, why not? And if you're going to parade her in front of the world, I'm imagining addressing these people, and make her the ambassador of the great city of Neom in Saudi Arabia, where there'll be robots. You won't have robots driving taxis, you'll have robots driving flying carpets. Well, if this fembot is going to be the ambassador of that project in that city, and the first creation of artificial intelligence to be granted citizenship of a country, then wouldn't it be appropriate not only to conduct a Turing test to prove that this android is what you claim it to be, but to do it before the eyes of the whole world? You've put her out there before the eyes of the whole world. Prove what she is before the entire world. Show us the evidence that Sophia, is more than just a ventriloquist dummy operated by sophisticated software. Prove it. Let's see the evidence. Now, in concluding this talk, I want to return to the notion of archontic dementia. And in doing so, I want to bring up a question or a few questions that come to my mind, and I'm sure they come to your mind as well. I'm sure they've come up for you in the course of listening to me go on here for an hour and 15 minutes. Anyone who has 2 grains of sense is bound to ask, well, why? I mean, why would they perpetuate such a fraud and such a ridiculous and easily refutable fraud? Why would they do any such thing? Well, could discuss this and speculate on this question for a long time. But right here, in concluding this talk, I'll give you 2 short answers. The first short answer is, they're insane. They are suffering from an advanced stage of archontic dementia, AD. But it's even worse than that. At the advanced stage, it becomes a 3-letter illness, like ADD, attention deficit disorder, or OCM, obsessive compulsive disorder. How about AMF, Archontic demential fantasy? If you, as a member of the audience, were to actually believe that the ventriloquist dummy was originating its own lines and jokes, you would be suffering from a mild case of AD, Archontic dementia. But those who are foisting the fraud of Sophia upon the world are at an extremely advanced stage where the Archontic dementia becomes a fantasy state. Therefore, ADF, Archontic demential fantasy. This android is a product of that fantasy, and those who produce it in some manner believe it to be what it is. Or they may not believe it, but they may believe that they can get others to believe it, which is another aspect of dementia. So the short answer is that they're insane and they're suffering from ADF, Archontic demential fantasy. That's the first short answer. The second short answer is that it's all a big front in order to hide what they are actually doing. That they are actually doing things that they don't want anyone in the world to know about. Things that are not just insane, but dangerously insane and insanely dangerous and anti-human. And that they are involved in these projects which they must keep secret. Were it to be known what they are actually doing, then they would meet some serious resistance and opposition. Part of the cover-up, part of the smoke and ladders that they use to conceal what they are doing may also be required because of the money involved. And they are laundering money. And they are laundering massive amounts of money and committing this money to very illicit and illegal projects of one kind or another. And in order to cover all that up, well, what did they do? Well, they come out and dazzle the world with the most spectacular and advanced IT technology that you could ever imagine. And look, here is the proof. Here is the fembot, Sophia. And look at how she can make jokes and how she can play paper, stone, scissors. Oh, yeah, sure. Well, isn't that wonderful? Isn't that convincing? Well, I say, put it in a Faraday cage with a 10-year-old girl and have her, the 10-year-old girl, play a few rounds of paper, stone, scissors with it, the fembot, and see how that works out. I can think of any number of ways to test this android, to see what its actual capacities are. And what I would like to do in the follow-up talk to this one is to tell you what some of those tests are and continue to delve into the subject of Archontic dementia. So the next talk, let's say Archontic dementia part 2, would be called The Singularity of November 2017. Sophia the android versus Sophia the goddess. Something along those lines, okay? In that follow-up talk, I will continue to discuss the Turing test and variations on the Turing test that anyone could easily devise or propose so that the world at large could see by demonstration what are the actual capacities of this construction, this simulacrum, and compare its actual capacities with those that are claimed for it. So in a way you could say that the appearance of Sophia is kind of a Turing test for humanity at large as well. The appearance of this android on the world stage signals a moment, a critical moment, in human apprehension of the true nature and possibilities of AI, and at the same time, the true nature and possibilities of human intelligence itself. What a moment this is. Sophia is a test of human intelligence to those in the world today who become aware that it is there. The android itself needs to be tested according to the lines I've said. Go research the Turing test, Turing, and find out for yourself. But in addition to the testing of the robot is a testing of human intelligence. It's a testing of how easily you can be duped. And that test comes at a really critical time in Sophia's correction. So in the forthcoming talk, and perhaps a third one to follow that, I intend to pick up the theme of the Aeon Sophia in correction and to contrast and juxtapose in the fashion of a kind of mirroring the reality of Sophia's correction against the fraud of the fembot, Sophia. So until then, as always, I'll leave you with this Gnostic intel, unique on the planet, and may the attention you give to it be rewarded by the truth.